For our New Testament reading, and the reading on which this morning's teaching is based, we're going to look at the Gospel of John, the fourth chapter of the Gospel of John, verses 1 to 26. So if you have a Bible, I would encourage you to turn there. It's a fairly well-known story if you've been around the church, if you've read the Bible in any significant way before. And actually, we're going to split this story into two parts. This morning we're going to look at part one, which is the actual conversation that Jesus has with this woman at the well. She's often referred to as the woman at the well. And this morning we're going to look at the conversation, the actual conversation that Jesus has. And then in part two, next week, we're going to look at the reaction to this conversation and the effects of the conversation on the woman and on the people around them. So today it's part one, and that's verses 1 to 26. And if you're able, let me ask you to stand as I read this. And when I'm done, I'm going to make the declaration that this is the word of the Lord, and I'm going to invite you to respond by saying, "Thanks be to God." John chapter 4, verses 1 to 26. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." And Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You're right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated. Now, I'm not going to spend as much time on some of the historical and cultural context of this here. We could certainly do that. It's actually somewhat important, and there are really some important points to be made about how Jesus breaks across cross-cultural boundaries here, racial boundaries, gender barriers, all those kinds of things. Some really good application, but I'm not going to focus there. Neither am I going to approach the text as an evangelism case study. You can do that. That's commonly done. I've actually done that before in a sermon, but I'm not going to do that either. Instead, what I want to do is I want to focus on how Jesus reveals himself as the only real satisfaction to our deepest needs and longings. How he reveals himself to this woman as her only real solution to her desire for satisfaction, and how he reveals himself to us in the same way. That's where I want to focus. Now, let me tell you why I think that's what's needed here this morning. It's interesting. I've had at least 4 or 5 people in the last week tell me that they're just feeling a little bit blah right now, kind of depressed. Maybe not in a purely clinical kind of way, but depressed just down, just kind of just sluggish, just cranky, or as the cool kids kind of say, just like meh, just kind of like that. Now, I felt the same things. In some ways, I think it's actually fairly predictable for the first week of January. The holiday bustle, even if you complained about it at the time, kept you too busy to dwell on some of the other things that were going on in your life. And at the very least, it allowed you to say with those things, well, I'll worry about that after New Year's. I'll worry about it then. Well, here we are. It's now January. It's back to work. It's back to school. And maybe you're busier than you'd like, having to deal with the things of your life that you just put off. Maybe it's the opposite, though. Maybe you're not actually all that busy. Maybe it's back to nothing. Back to boredom as the parties and the special events and the things on your calendar kind of come to an end. One friend texted me that this week. He's lonely. He doesn't live nearby around here or whatever, but he's lonely. He doesn't have a whole lot to do, and everything's kind of stopped, and that's what has him down. Right? There's just the weather. It's dark. It's cold. One by one. I don't know about you. Like on one by one, the houses on my block this week have turned off the lights that have been up for Christmas. It's slowly getting darker and darker along my street, and you're feeling very little motivation now. I mean, we're up to the 11th. We have very little motivation to carry through on the resolutions that just 11 days ago seemed like really good ideas. Right? Now, not to paint too bleak a picture, but this feeling, to a greater or lesser degree, is a universal feeling for human beings at all times. It's a thirst for something more. It's a longing for somewhere else. It's a desire that we can't quite seem to satisfy. So are you feeling meh this morning at the beginning of January? Now, who would you like to blame for that? Right? You can blame your things, which means you just need to find new things. I got to buy something new. I got to buy something shiny. You can blame your parents. That's a common kind of a thing in the world today. You can blame the healthcare system, capitalism, big government. You can blame God, or you could just vaguely kind of blame the universe and just be angry at everything. But what people do have a harder time identifying is blaming. Oh my goodness. Siri is talking to me. What we have a harder time blaming is our relationship with God. Is our broken relationship with God that comes through our worship of a false Messiah. But ultimately, that's exactly the problem that Jesus is trying to get this woman to face. She was looking for satisfaction, and she was looking in all the wrong places. And Jesus sought her out to offer her something that she wasn't expecting. True satisfaction for the deep needs of her heart. And he offers this satisfaction to her by offering himself. So in our investigation of the identity of Jesus this winter, that we're going to see in John 4, 5, and 6. Let's start by looking at how he presents himself to this woman. Now, there's headings in the bulletin that will follow, that kind of follow the flow of the text that we'll walk through. And I encourage you, as we kind of go through, you can try to match each section of where we are, what I'm talking about, to the heading as I explain it. And then I'll circle back at the end and hopefully try to make sense of it all. But let's start at the beginning of John 4. And if I were to do some of the cultural historical context here, this would be the spot, because the occasion for Jesus meeting this woman is water. And the conversation happens at a well in Samaria in the middle of the day. And Jesus isn't there by accident. This isn't an accidental time. There were other ways for Jesus to get from Judea to Galilee. They were longer ways, but most devout Jews actually of the time wouldn't have gone through Samaria because they didn't want to associate with Samaritans. John actually parenthetically puts that as a comment, right? Jews did not commonly associate themselves with Samaritans. And in the reading that we had from the Old Testament, from 2 Kings, we got the historical background for that. Right? These were not pure ethnic Jews. They were the remnants of the northern tribes of Israel who, through centuries of both exile in other lands and intermarriage with surrounding nations, were now regarded as essentially half-breeds, a subcategory of Jews. So it says something that Jesus is in Samaria at all. But then, verse 4, it says he had to pass through Samaria. And I think that's at least in part because of the fact that he had this noontime appointment that he had scheduled with this woman at the well. Now, she was probably there at noon, the hottest part of the day, the 6th hour, because it was when she could come alone. Now, her lifestyle, which we learn a little bit more as we read in due time, her lifestyle likely made her unwelcome among the other women who would have been coming to the well earlier in the day, at the cooler, more reasonable time of the day. But here she is, coming now, and there Jesus is. And what does Jesus do? He asks her for a drink. And she feels immediately the tension of the interaction because of the racial and the gender barriers here. But Jesus had asked her a very simple question about getting a drink of water because, likely, on the surface, at the very surface level, he was thirsty. Very natural. His disciples had gone into town to get some food. It was the middle of the day. There he was sitting, and he was thirsty. But he also asked her the question because he intended to start a conversation about water. And then he turns the conversation to the spiritual, because when she says, why do you ask me for a drink? She's thinking of the cultural and the social taboos that Jesus is breaking by talking to her, but Jesus turns it on her. And he says, in effect, well, actually, if you knew who I was, then you'd be the one who would be asking me for a drink of water. But he doesn't just say asking me for a drink of water. He says, you'd be asking me for a drink of living water. And even to this woman's non-spiritual understanding, there would have been a difference between water and living water. That phrase, living water, would have referred to fresh, running water from a spring. Now, most water collected for most people for common use in the region at the time was collected from cisterns. These were holes dug to capture rainwater, either more or less sophisticated, but they could obviously easily run out if there was no continuous source of water. But a spring, whether it was underground at a really good well or above ground, kind of bubbling up and flowing, a spring was running water. And just like today, having running water without a worry of the supply drying up, that would have been a very big deal. And so she says to him, where will you get this living water? In the city of Philadelphia, you could actually, if you wanted, do a self-guided tour of historic public drinking fountains. Not sure who might think that was a good idea for a great day, but you could do it. You could do a really good tour if you wanted to, because in the 1790s, after a couple of really severe yellow fever outbreaks in the city of Philadelphia, a terrible disease that's largely preventable by having clean drinking water, the city formed the Philadelphia Watering Committee. And it was formed, and a public water system was built. And along the system, a number of public fountains were constructed where people could get clean water for their homes, for their animals. And this was a big deal. It was a big deal for sanitation and for health and for all that. Well, in Fairmount Park, a park in the western part of the city, near Lemon Hill on Sedgley Drive, if you're planning your tour, there is an old concrete fountain. And it's no longer functional, but it's there as a monument. And inscribed in concrete on the top of this fountain is the phrase that says, "Whoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again." And it's true. We live in an age of intense and unsatisfied thirst. The famous Hollywood actress of the golden age, Audrey Hepburn, she once said, "Success is like reaching an important birthday and finding that you're exactly the same." A more contemporary Hollywood actor, Jim Carrey, he once said that he thought everyone should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so that they could see that it's not the answer. Now, it's easy for them to say, right? But if you listen, it's the universal evaluation of everyone. I could give you quotes for a half an hour to an hour over and over again. Whether it's in sports or business or politics or entertainment, there's a universal sense of thirst that is not satisfied even when we get what we think we want. The question is, when we recognize that universal thirst, when we recognize that the water that we're drinking from is not actually satisfying us, where do we go then? Because that question of what we do when we recognize our dehydration, that becomes the significant one. I was reading a little bit about people who suffer severe dehydration. It's terrible. Now, there are stages to it. First, it can sap your strength. It can make you feel really lethargic. You can even, for a time, kind of fall asleep, go into like a little bit of a coma. But then, oftentimes, the lethargy and the comatose state, it almost leads to madness, like to manic, hallucination. And it can lead you to drink almost anything, even if that thing will kill you. Now, spiritually speaking, this happens all the time with our thirst, right? With our search for something more that we're looking to satisfy us. Right? Some people are just sleeping, they get depressed, they retreat into solitude, they're temporarily unaware of the fact that they're not satisfied. But others, then they're driven to drink almost in a maniac kind of a way, to drink something that they think will satisfy them, even if it won't, even if it will ultimately kill you. There's a scene in a movie I once saw where one character is seeking revenge against another guy, and he drives him out into the middle of the desert and he leaves him there. But before he drives away, he takes a can of motor oil from his trunk and he tosses it to him. And he says, "I bet you won't make it 20 miles before you'll consider drinking that." And then he leaves. That's horrific. The point is, whatever it is, whether it's with the relatively innocent things of life or with the absolutely gruesome things, our spiritual thirst for something more drives us to seek satisfaction from fountains that can't do what they promise to do. And the woman at the well is doing that too, because she's looking for something else. And that's what Jesus does when he continues the conversation. He puts his finger on the fountain from which she's been drinking. She asks him for water that will never leave her thirsty again, verse 15. And Jesus says, "Go call your husband and come here." Which might seem at first like Jesus is changing the subject, but he's not changing the subject. He's actually going after her choice of beverage. He's putting his finger on her fountain. And she confesses that she doesn't have a husband. And Jesus knows this, of course. She's living with a man, but she's not married to him. And apparently, he's just the next in a long line of men. Apparently, she's been married 5 times, and now she's given up on the institution entirely, and she's just ignoring the need for marriage altogether. Now, this is shocking. And even in our age, this would be somewhat scandalous. This is a woman of reputation. That's why she comes to the well at noontime, when no one else is around. But even more shocking to her, I'm sure, is that Jesus knows these things. How does he know this? But he does. And Jesus isn't changing the subject. Like I said, he's getting right to the point. And he does this, well, notice this about Jesus, he does this perfectly with everyone he encounters. Right? With the rich young ruler and the tax collector Zacchaeus, their issue was money. That was their fountain. So Jesus puts his finger on their fountain when he interacts with them. Right? With the rich young ruler, he says, look, you're drinking from the fountain of money. It's not going to satisfy you. I want you to sell everything you have. Right? With Nicodemus, the religious leader, back in John chapter 3, for him it's not money, it's his heritage, it's his religious heritage, it's his Jewish identity. It's the heritage and the ethnicity into which he was born. And that's why Jesus puts his finger on his Jewish heritage fountain, and he says, I think you're drinking from the wrong fountain. You need to be born not into an ethnic heritage, you need to be born again. You see, he does something different with Nicodemus. And with this woman, he says, I think you're drinking of the fountain of male companionship and sexual fulfillment, but how's that working for you? You think it'll satisfy you. It won't. Now, he doesn't actually say those words, but that's what he's doing. That's why he's going to this subject. That's what he intends. That's why he's talking about her love life as the personal application of looking for living water in all the places that won't satisfy. Now, what's that for you? What's the equivalent of put yourself in this woman, in the place of this woman. What's the equivalent of your husband, for example? Or you use that as a metaphor, right? Look, the underlying desire of what a husband represents is not a wrong one. Right? What's that represent? Acceptance. To be known and loved unconditionally. We were built for human relationship. No doubt that's what this woman was looking for. It's not even wrong to say, though there are some called by God to remain single, it's not even wrong to say that that's what we were designed for. Companionship in the state of marriage. But this woman is looking for eternal and ultimate acceptance and unconditional love. She's looking for it in the wrong place. Now, she knows this to some degree. We know that Jesus has put his finger on it because what does she do? Well, it seems like now it's her turn to change the subject. Move on to the next section, verses 19 to 24. What does it look like she's doing here? Well, what it looks like on the face of it is she's doing the classic theological dodge. Right? You know about the theological dodge? Right? Whenever a spiritual discussion starts to get a little bit too personal, whenever it seems like God starts sticking his nose into something that you want him to keep out of, we're tempted to do the theological dodge. For example, it happens a lot with money. God starts challenging us with how we use our money, and all of a sudden, we want to do a deep PhD study on the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew word for tithe. Right? And whether the historical archaeology of the early church indicates whether people were giving to the church with pre-tax or after-tax income. Right? Or, like with the woman at the well and sexuality and marriage, right? Start talking about God's design for sexual expression being intended for marriage between a man and a woman, and all of a sudden people want to do a Greek word study on the lexical range of the word porneia in the Greek and get a PhD in the historical context of sexuality in the Roman Empire. Now, none of those studies are wrong, and actually people have already done them, so you can save the time. But the point is, we often raise the religious and the theological questions as a distraction or as a dodge. And the woman here seemingly changes the subject entirely. She says, back to verse 20, "Our fathers," meaning the Samaritans, "worshipped on this mountain," meaning Mount Gerizim, their traditional place of Samaritan worship. "But you say," Jesus, "you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Right? And the implied question is, which is it? You seem like a really smart religious guy. Right? That's her question. And actually, I don't think it's an irrelevant question. I don't actually think that it's a complete, total change of the subject. I think it's actually the next logical question to ask, whether she realizes it or not. Because she's asking about the proper and the appropriate way to approach God. She's asking Jesus the right way to acceptably come into God's presence. Now you kind of say, how does Jesus answer this? Does he say it even matters? Some people have tried to interpret Jesus' answer as him kind of being all relativistic and saying it doesn't really matter. Like he's saying in verse 23, Jewish or Samaritan, Jerusalem, Gerizim, it doesn't matter. That's not what he's saying. Right? He actually says that up to this point, the Jews had it right. We worship what we know. We worship according to knowledge. And the Samaritans had it wrong. You worship what you do not know. You do not worship according to knowledge. But what he says here, when he says that the hour has arrived for true worshipers to worship in spirit and truth, what he's saying is that a right relationship with God goes far deeper than the external stuff of temples and rituals. It goes to the depths of the heart. Charles Spurgeon once said, "God does not regard our voices, he hears our hearts. And if our hearts do not sing, we have not sung at all." Isn't that a great quote? I kind of feel like as we're singing, I want to put that right up here. God does not regard our voices. In my case, that's a very good thing. Right? He hears our hearts. And if our hearts do not sing, we have not sung at all. That's what Jesus is doing. He's pushing worship and right relationship with God down to the very heart level of our standing with him. Now, I told you that the almost universal opinion of the scholars and the commentators and stuff that I read is that the woman here is doing a theological dodge here. But I was reading R. Kent Hughes the other day. He's a retired pastor, scholar, a former professor of practical theology at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. And Dr. Hughes offers a slightly different perspective. He says that her acknowledgement of Jesus as a prophet was a signal that she was, at least in some way, being challenged by what he was saying to her, to the point that the sin in her life that Jesus was putting his finger on was becoming more glaring in the presence of this incredible man. And she knew that something needed to be done about this sin in her life. Now, like with the unshakable joy for which we all long, that's represented by the thirst-quenching living water, and like with the unconditional acceptance and love that's represented by the perfect husband who won't fail you, just like with those things, this too is a universal longing, right? When you come face to face with your sin and your unworthiness to be in the presence of God, the question naturally comes, how do I get right with him? How do I come to him? Do I come here? Do I come there? What's the right way to do it? Where can you go? And if that's what the woman meant, well, from that point of view, her question about worship becomes not a dodge so much as an entirely relevant question, because she's asking, okay, if I were to seek a restored relationship with God, where would I go? I know where my people would have gone. I know what they had done, but you're Jewish. Where should I go to get right with God? Now, maybe this is what she meant. Maybe it isn't with that level of clarity, but one way or the other, that's exactly the point that Jesus is making. He's telling her that the hour is now here for getting right with God. He's identified her inability to satisfy herself with the water of this world specific to her. And now he tells her how to get right with God. It won't take a sacrifice on Gerizim to be forgiven. She doesn't need the temple in Jerusalem to be made right with God. The path to rightness with God is standing right in front of her, which is where she goes in verse 25. Because she recognizes, and it is amazing to me, that the hour of getting right with God, the time of true forgiveness that leads to genuine worship, it comes, in some way, there's a connection with the arrival of the Messiah. She says, when Messiah comes, and Jesus, in an absolute masterful leading of the conversation, brings the interaction to this climax with this amazing mic drop moment. And he says, I who speak to you am he. Now, with other interactions with people, as we'll see, Jesus can be a little bit more cryptic about his identity as Messiah, especially at the beginning of his ministry, which is where we still are here. But he's not hiding anything here. John regards Jesus using language like this on a few occasions. And what Jesus is doing is unmistakable. The literal word order in the Greek, word for word, is, I am the one speaking to you. And I am has no, if you're grammar, it has no predicate. It's literally ego eimi, I am. And that's the phrase that carries immense weight in the Hebrew Scriptures, because this is how God identified himself to Moses at the burning bush. When Moses asked who he should tell the people was sending them to rescue them, God answers, tell them, I am sent you. Right? The forever existing, uncreated, eternal, all-powerful God. And Jesus, here, as he claims the title of Messiah for himself, takes onto his lips the identity of the eternal God of Moses, the God who brought the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, that God. And he says, it's me. And I'm here to bring you out of slavery. That's who is standing in front of this woman, this outcast, half-breed, scandalous Samaritan woman. And that's who stands in front of you. Now, follow through the headings in your bulletin and we'll wrap this up. And look, what we seek and what we long for is what Jesus, here and throughout the writings of the New Testament, claims alone to be. Do you seek happiness and joy and purpose and satisfaction that never runs dry? Jesus is the one who experienced the judgment of eternal thirst so that he can be your living water. Do you seek perfect acceptance and care and love and respect and protection without abuse, without disdain, without rejection? Jesus is your eternal husband, the one of Ephesians 4, who sacrifices himself for his bride to make her holy and blameless. Do you seek right standing with God, freedom from guilt, access into his presence? Jesus' body is the eternal temple where your final sacrifice was made to secure your forever worship. The Messiah is come. Now, next week we'll continue the story because this woman's life will never be the same. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we confess that we so often look for satisfaction in places that can't give life. Thank you for meeting our need, for offering us living water that truly satisfies. Turn our hearts away from what leaves us empty. Deepen our thirst for you alone. Help us to drink daily from your grace and to find our joy and our rest and our fullness in you, for we ask it in your name. Amen.